So race matters. It's one of the most important parts of your identity, and race-blind casting that gives parts written with white people in mind to black actors is an insult to black artists and black art, and it's an attempt to erase black culture, really. At least that's the central position of Argus Wilson's 1996 speech, The Ground on Which I Stand. Hello, comrades. Today we'll be talking about whether representation in art matters, and what that representation should look like, and we're going to try to understand the perspective of Argus Wilson, who's famous for writing the Century Cycle, a group of 10 plays, each one showing a decade of the black experience in the 20th century in the United States. And he says that black Americans are Africans in America and that they have a history and cultural exchange from generation to generation, stretching back to before slavery, creating a unique culture separate from white American culture. And I'm not exactly sure if I necessarily agree that there's some that makes black Americans African, but I do think his broader point is true that race has been an important category and that black Americans have formed their own culture, and that as a black man, he had learned his eating habits, language, religious beliefs, concepts of beauty, as well as many other things from black people, mostly his parents, who also learned it from their parents, who learned it from their own parents, and so on and so forth, going all the way back to, the first time a black person set foot in America. So he's also correct that black Americans have created their own art, obviously. I think anyone who looks at the history of American music and, the origins of blues, jazz, rock, disco, and rap would have to agree black Americans have created their own art. It's just a fact. They've created a lot of very influential art at a very high level of quality. And given that black artists have created so much art at such a high quality, Argus Wilson presents us with a question. Why are there so few black theaters, specifically, when it comes to plays, who's a playwright? And at the time of his speech, there were over 60 League of Resident theaters, and only one he could consider to be black. And he says the problem is not a lack of talent, for there are many talented black artists and performers and playwrights who work in theater. And he says it's not a lack of interest, for many black people are interested in the theater. He says it's really a problem of funding, of finances, of money. Theaters often work on a membership basis, and that means people who are rich enough to buy many tickets in a single season are given a discount and additional power in determining what a theater might show. And those who can only afford a single ticket are burdened with an increased price. And on top of that, grants and public funding are rarely given to black theatrical productions. However, Argus Wilson is not fatalistic in this assessment. He thinks we can change, and, you know, I'm unclear about what the American theatrical landscape looks like now, but I do think there has been an increase in large-scale movies made by black filmmakers, since the 90s when this speech was given, Movies like Sinners and Us and Moonlight stand out in recent years. Not to say that the current level of representation is perfect, or even acceptable at the moment. Now, I can imagine some pushback, someone asking why exactly it's so important for there to be movies and plays specifically produced by black artists. Why does Argus Wilson want there to be more black theaters? And to understand this, I think it's important to take a broader look at Argus Wilson's views of representation. Argus Wilson is not simply saying, he's not simply arguing for more black actors to be in white plays. And I think this is what many people, particularly those on the right, imagine when they think of efforts to increase diversity in the arts. They point to kind of cultural topics like a Black Little Mermaid or the Black Helen of Troy in the upcoming Odyssey movie directed by Christopher Nolan. But this isn't really what Argus Wilson's talking about. It's not what he wanted, nor does he really consider it to be good. And really, he speaks up against, colorblind casting, saying, quote, to mount an all-black production of Death of a Salesman or any other play conceived for white actors as an investigation of the human condition through the specifics of white culture is to deny us our humanity, our own history, and the need to make our own investigations from the cultural ground on which we stand as black Americans. It is an insult to our intelligence, our playwrights, to our society, and to the world at large. I found this to be interesting. Now, you may have noticed that I'm white. I kind of blocked out the window because it was glaring. Someone pointed out in my last video, but I imagine it's still pretty obvious that I'm a white person. My brother took one of those DNA tests and said, Liam, we're white. I'm like, yeah, I know, brother. I've been to the beach before. I know I'm white. I didn't need a DNA test to tell me that. And so many of the people who I know are generally what could be understood as white liberal. So my perception of how the discussion around colorblind casting goes is generally, it might be biased from my own personal experience, but generally, a conservative complains about the so-called erasure of white identity, which to me and the other people I know who are kind of like white liberals for the most part, think that's really kind of an over-the-top reaction. Like we aren't being erased. Like it feels more like they can't stand seeing black people in movies. Do you remember when there was that entire uproar over when they had a black stormtrooper in a Star Wars movie? That was just kind of ridiculous, honestly. So, from my perspective, things like this really tend not to actually matter. It's a red flag that people on the right care so much about this, about a black little mermaid. But from a diversity or inclusion perspective, really it seems tokenistic at best. It doesn't seem to be really accomplishing anything. And race swapping is best done with characters whose race is not a central part of their character, which means when done well, it still doesn't add to the story or change the plot in any way. It just changes the color of the faces of the actors in the least intrusive way possible. It doesn't do anything. Whereas actual stories written around people of specific races or ethnic backgrounds can be important and add some level of actual diversity to the media that is produced. It's important to the story, for example, the story in the setting of Moana, that Moana is Polynesian. It's important to the setting and plot of Sinners that Smoke and Steak are black. It's important to the setting of Black Panther that Wakanda is in Africa. And so this distinguishes actual cultural diversity in media from performative corporate slop. If you could just swap out the colors and nothing really changes, it doesn't matter. But if it is part of the context of the story, if it's part of the setting, if it's part of the plot, then it does matter. It has the opportunity at least to really kind of create a story from a separate perspective. So I found the idea that race-blind swapping isn't just tokenistic and, a cynical attempt at a milquetoast inclusion in a way that requires minimal effort, but, that is actually something bad and an insult to black culture quite interesting. On the right, they complain about the fact that it only seems to go in one direction. White characters can be swapped for black characters, but black characters cannot be swapped for white characters. But that makes sense. Like, if you swap Othello out for a white actor, it's a problem because Othello's blackness is central to his character. Black characters rarely exist in a way where their race isn't central to their characters, often central to their circumstances, treatment, style, setting. Determining who can be race swapped can be quite challenging. Many liberals said there wasn't a problem with race swapping the Little Mermaid because the Little Mermaid is a mythical creature who exists outside of human society and in any kind of human context. She lives in a context without any kind of racial importance. And if you change the color of her skin, nothing else really changes. But, like, what about Helen of Troy? Helen of Troy is from a Greek story and should be Greek looking, like, historically speaking. So, does her race matter? And really, to me, this seems like kind of an editorial decision. Any movie adaptation of the Odyssey must change things. It cannot be accurate. So, how do you decide what to keep and what to change? What matters to make an authentic story or even just something recognizable as the Odyssey? And personally, given that it's a modern movie set in a modern language, it's set in English, not even modern Greek, far away from, the original ancient Greek, I think any notion of maintaining authenticity is kind of thrown out the window the moment you decide to produce the movie in English. The Odyssey may be an epic Greek poem, but Christopher Nolan's Odyssey is an American movie. So for me, race doesn't really matter. But many on the right seem to disagree. They seem to think race is important regardless of whether other aspects of the movie are authentic or not. But like maybe this entire area of thought is misguided. Maybe the reason that it seems like the race of many white characters doesn't matter, isn't part of who they are as characters, is simply the result of white defaultism, the idea that white is normal, and so if you see a white character, you don't racialize them, you don't consider them as white, you just see them as the character. And the fact is that if there were, originally made a different race, if that character was originally a different race, that would have had an effect on the story. And so making them white in the first place had an effect, because if it had been any other race, it would have had an effect. August Wilson says that to force black artists to perform white plays, white parts, is to deny their history. We are denying the cultural differences of black people by pretending that they can act white characters without a difference, and we're negating the opportunity for them to play characters that were originally meant for black actors, for black characters. And honestly, I must, admit here that, like, as of yet, I cannot fully agree with Argus Wilson's take. I do not think it is a bad thing to make The Little Mermaid black. I don't think it matters. Nor do I think an all-black production of A Death of a Salesman would be innately bad. It might be kind of interesting. Likely, it would be just like any other production of Death of a Salesman. I don't think it's really creating an evil in the world. And we can look again at, the Nolan Odyssey movie. Nobody says that it is an insult to American art or American culture to have Americans act Greek roles. Nobody is saying that we are erasing our history by turning Greek poems into American movies. And this is despite the fact that, white and black Americans are culturally far closer than any American is to an ancient Greek, even a Greek American. And even if you made it more Greek, if you made it more historically accurate, even if you made it the actors speak Greek, no reasonable person would say it was erasing American culture. If you performed a play by Euripides in the original Greek and didn't change a single word, it would not erase a single ounce of American culture. Although, I must admit here that the context of these two things are not the same. The Odyssey, playing in an American theater, is a brief exception to the status quo. There are plenty of American movies about Americans, and that's for funding that's not really dependent on any connection to Greek culture. If the only movies produced in the US were adaptations of Greek works, we might begin to wonder why we couldn't create our own stories about our own experiences, why a movie about Americans couldn't get funding. But obviously, that's not the case. So, August Wilson says, quote, "By making money available to theaters willing to support colorblind casting, the financiers and governors have signaled not only their unwillingness to support black theater, but their willingness to fund dangerous and divisive assaults against it." And so I do kind of wonder if his attitude would have shifted in a context in which there were many black-made plays with characters written to be black. Maybe his position on colorblind casting would be different in such a context where it was more akin to an American making an adaptation of a Greek play. After all, the core concern seems to be that, because black people are culturally distinct, in order to capture the entirety of American culture, we must be open to accepting and promoting black culture, black American theater. To lock black Americans out of American theater is to cheapen American theater, to stop it from showing us the entirety of the country and culture that we share, and it's to hold us back artistically. He says our institutions which favor white playmakers promote white plays for their whiteness and not for their artistic merit. So a system where plays made by members of every race will only serve for us to raise our collective artistic standards. And personally, I know that consuming art from other cultures, from other races, genders, religions, and languages has been an amazing experience. It has expanded my horizons and introduced me to many of my current favorite things. And I know that Argus Wilson, who's also a great admirer of Greek playwrights like Sophocles and great Latin American writers like Jorge Luis Borges, profited tremendously from art from many cultures and perspectives. And I think that it's something that is important for us to consider as Americans, or if you're not an American watching this, as a person in the world. And I think us, Americans, we're suffering from an art world that is being strangled by capital and its economic context. Hollywood pushes out movie after movie after movie that either feels like a remake of a movie you have already seen several times, or literally is a remake of a movie you've already seen several times. Our social media feeds are filled with AI-generated images, music, and writing, and But large movies which break from the mold are a welcome retreat into a freer and more interesting artistic way of expressing ourselves. And they're often movies which focus on the lives of people who aren't like cishet white Anglos, like Sinners, Us, American Fiction, or Everything Everywhere All at Once. These are not movies that take away from movies made by white filmmakers, but they are movies that raise the standard for all filmmakers to expand our shared culture. Overall, I think this speech is interesting. I hope it will be useful, when thinking about Arctis Wilson's plays, which I will be making videos about. But I think it's also worth considering, for thinking about diversity and our media consumption in general. I think people often fear tokenism when they actively try to consume art by people from diverse racial groups and backgrounds, or any other kind of diversity. I've often heard people say that they simply read or watch whatever interests them or whatever is considered the best. And I don't think there's anything spectacularly wrong with this approach to, consuming art. But I do think if our goal with art is to find the best art, to understand the human condition better, empathize and understand our fellow human better, expand our mind and understand the world better, trying to find artists from diverse backgrounds will probably be the best way forward. And if you find that you only read like male authors or white authors or American authors, you will undoubtedly not be reading the best, and you will certainly not have the widest grasp of artistic expression. And this is the reason I try to read works from different places, experiences, cultures, etc. To see as much art as I can. If you'd like to join me on my journey, then feel free to subscribe. I will be discussing each of the 10 plays of Arctis Wilson's Century Cycle. I'll also talk about other films, animated movies, books, and language. And I have a project I want to get back to where I try to read at least one book from every English-speaking country. There are a lot of them, apparently. It's a little tricky. But reading this play, I learned a new word, proscenium, which is the stage area between the curtains and the orchestra. And remember, good night, good day, and good potato.